Hello YouTube, welcome back to Olympus, and today I've been thinking. It's become quite popular to rag on modern bodybuilders, accusing them of being overly bloated and soft and not as good quality as bodybuilders from earlier eras. Now, many of these issues raised are valid, but I've always thought that the hate for the modern mass monster was a little unfair. So I've decided to line up 5 bodybuilders from the modern era, and by modern I mean the 2010s, and 5 bodybuilders from the 90s, which many people believe to be the greatest era in bodybuilding, and actually compare them side by side. These 10 bodybuilders are or were top Mr. Olympia contenders. Not winners, but contenders. The idea of this matchup isn't to see which era had the best champions, but to see how the field of competitors stack up. Representing the modern era, we have William Bonac, Cedric McMillan, Rolly Winkler, Brandon Curry, and Big Ramy. Representing the 90s, we have Sean Ray, Nasser El Sonbadi, Kevin Laverny, Flex Wheeler, and Paul Dillet. Now, these matchups will be chosen at random, so some may seem like poor or unfair pairings, but I did this mainly to avoid any bias for either era. So, with that said, let's get into the first matchup, and it's an interesting one. William Bonac versus Paul Dillet, two very different kinds of physiques. Paul Dillet competed at the Olympia 5 times, with his highest placing being in 1994 when he placed 4th behind Kevin Laverny. He competed 40 times throughout his pro career, with his best win being the 1999 Night of Champions. And Paul was an absolute freak. He was billed at 6'2" and had a reported competition weight of roughly 285 pounds. Yet despite this enormous size, he still boasted a tight midsection, making him one of the rare aesthetic mass monsters. Despite his virtues, however, his poor posing often held him back. He couldn't hold poses for long, and he couldn't even hit properly many of the mandatory poses. Now, William Bonac has only competed at the Olympia 3 times in his pro career so far, but he hasn't placed outside of the top 5, with his best placing being 3rd at the 2017 Mr. Olympia, behind Big Ramy. He also managed to secure an impressive win at the 2018 Arnold Classic, beating the likes of Dexter Jackson, Cedric McMillan, and Rolly Winkler. Now, Bonac is often criticised for his poor structure. He stands 5'7" and weighs about 235 pounds on stage. His short stature combined with narrow shoulders and blocky waist mean that he's quite limited structurally. But what he lacks in structure, he makes up for with superb muscular inserts and overall completeness. Bonac has almost no missing body parts, and to top it off, he's usually on when it comes to conditioning. Now that we've covered the history of these two competitors, let's get into the actual pose down. And first up, we have the front relaxed. And the first few poses are really going to highlight Paul Dillet's structural superiority. First of all, Paul Dillet would be absolutely dwarfing William Bonac on stage. Obviously, these pictures aren't to scale, but as I mentioned earlier, Paul Dillet stood roughly 6'2", William Bonac 5'7", and the weight difference between them was about 50 pounds. Not to mention, at least relatively speaking, Paul Dillet had a much tighter midsection and much broader shoulders, meaning that he would just completely outmass William Bonac in every way. It's often said that standing relaxed, Paul Dillet was Mr. Olympia. No one could beat his genetically gifted structure. Bonac, on the flip side, the front relaxed, while it does show his superb muscle insertions, he's just too limited structurally to be good in this pose. So, Paul Dillet wins the front relaxed. Now, moving on to the next pose, we have the front double bicep, and once again, it's a similar story. Now, Bonac has very good muscle insertions, that's true. Very low inserting lats, great quads and calves, very nice peaked and full biceps and triceps, and good forearms, but he's just too narrow through the chest and shoulders, and his midsection is very blocky, which really detracts from his overall V-taper and aesthetics. He also looks a little bit too soft in this pose. Oh, by the way, I should point out, I'm not using pictures from specific years per se, just pictures across their pro career. Anyway, back to it. Paul Dillet, on the other hand, looks absolutely monstrous in this pose. an amazingly tight midsection, huge flaring lats and broad shoulders, and absolutely ginormous arms. Like, those things look completely unreal. In fact, I actually wouldn't be surprised if that photo is Photoshop, so if it is, I apologize for that. But even if it is, Dillet was still just so much more genetically gifted than Bonac, and Bonac simply can't hang with him in the front double bicep. So Dillet wins the front double bicep. Now moving on to the Absinthe Eyes, and this is probably Bonac's worst pose, because it really highlights just how poor his V-taper is, and also shows how bad his abs are. And his abdominals are the one weak muscle group that he has. They're incredibly blurry, no nice insertions, no nice lines, not very well cut, and somewhat bloated as well. And combined with the blocky midsection and narrow shoulders, he's just not well suited for this pose. To his credit, he does have incredibly great thighs and quads, but, Portalets are holding up as well. And you can actually see he looks like he has slightly more feathering in this pose. Bonac has a better sweep, but Paul's got better conditioning. Obviously, his abs are much better, much more defined, much tighter midsection. His lats are flaring out more. His chest looks huge, and he's just too broad upstairs for Bonac to hang with. So, Dillet wins the Absinthe Eyes. Now onto the front lat spread, and this is a pose that Bonac is also not particularly well suited to. He has a very similar problem to Phil Heath, in that, like I've said several times now, he's just too narrow upstairs, and his midsection is blocky, although it doesn't really look too bad from this angle. But his chest looks pinched, and he's just lacking a good V-taper. However, we could have an upset because Paul was pretty terrible at hitting this pose as well. Although in theory he should be dominating with it, he just really sucked at spreading his lats out. He just was not good at it. And this is where my critique of Paul starts. He was pretty terrible at hitting a large number of the mandatory poses. Now, this pose still goes to Dillet just for his overwhelming size, but he's not running away with it, and he should be running away with it because he's just so much bigger and broader than William Bonac. But he just, for the life of him, could not spread out his lats, and that really hurts him in this pose. So, overall, Paul Dillet wins the front lat spread, but not by much, and you could honestly argue that Bonac could win it. Now, moving on to the side tricep, and unfortunately, it's really hard to find a side tricep picture of Paul Dillet. It was a pose that he just didn't seem to hit that often. Or, maybe he wasn't impressive enough for people to save pictures of him. Either way, it's really not fair to judge based off of this picture, with the terrible quality and angle. However, that being said, I'm tempted to give it to Bonac anyway, because frankly, William Bonac is, in my opinion, one of the best people in history to hit a side tricep. His arm and delts look absolutely huge in this pose. His triceps are popping out. The biceps look positively fake. His forearms are thick and well developed. He's got a huge quad sweep and pretty impressive hamstring sweep as well. His glutes look giant and conditioned. And I like that he's sticking out his calf and showing that off as well. His midsection is not, he doesn't look too bad in this position. It doesn't really look bloated or blocky. And his chest is quite full. And he's even popping his trap out a little bit there as well. Paul, although we can't really judge him, he was never very good at hitting poses. And I would be tempted to assume that he's not as good as it in this pose. Certainly from this angle, it doesn't look like he's hitting it too well, even though I can't really see what he'd look like from a front angle. You can kind of tell he looks a bit hunched over in it. and his tricep doesn't look as big as Bonac's. So I'm gonna give the side tricep to William Bonac, but take it with a grain of salt, because obviously this isn't really a fair comparison for Paul. Moving on to the side chest, and this is a pose they both hit pretty well. Both of them look pretty broad in this pose. Their arms look giant, so their delts, their chest is thick and well developed. Midsection looks tight. It's not really shown here, but William does have a better side leg. You know, his quad sweep and his hamstring sweep is better. This one's a tough one. Even though Paul's chest is, I think, a bit thicker overall, I feel like Bonac's presentation is just a bit more balanced, you know, especially between his upper body and his lower body, because he's got better legs than Paul. His arms look a little bit better, perhaps, in this position, although not greatly. After looking at it a bit more, actually, I think Paul does win this pose. He's just too big for Bonac, but it is very close. They're both very good at hitting this pose. So I'll give the point to Bonac. I'll give the point to Dillet, but it could go either way. Now, moving on to the back double bicep, and this is Bonac's territory. And the back poses really highlight how terrible Paul Dillet was at actually hitting mandatory poses. He couldn't hit either of the back poses effectively at all. And you can see here now, his lats look incredibly underdeveloped from this angle, and I believe that's due to him just scrunching them too much. His delts look humorously huge, but they're just so imbalanced and overpowering the rest of his physique. His lower body is decently impressive, but I do prefer Bonac's. His glutes are proportionately larger, and his overall thigh mass looks greater and more balanced. But upstairs, he completely shuts the door on Paul Dillet. His lower lats are incredibly thick and well developed. Dillet's traps are bigger, but again, they're just too overpowering compared to his lats, and he just looks way too awkward in this pose to win it. He does have, like I said, very impressive delts and also very impressive arms. This bicep peak is, it's blowing Bonac's out of the water, but in terms of the overall completeness, you just have to go with Bonac, because Paul's lats are just lagging so far behind the rest of his body. So William Bonac wins the back double bicep. Moving on to the back lat spread, and once again, Dillet just can't hit this pose very well. You can see he's having a similar problem that he was having in the front lat spread, where he just can't spread out his lats very well. On the other hand, Bonac, he's not as good in this pose as some other people, because he is still narrow, so his V-taper is a little bit lacking. But you can see just all over his entire body is nothing but thick, dense muscle. There's nowhere on his frame that isn't just packed full of muscle. He's pretty similar to Kai Green in this pose in that he doesn't have a whole lot of detail and width, but he just has so much thickly packed, dense muscle, zero weak body parts, and his overall balance is just far superior to Paul's. So even though, once again, he should be running away with this pose because of his overwhelming width, his better traps, greater mass, he's losing because of his poor posing, and that's what held him back in his competition era. He couldn't hit the mandatory poses. So William Bonac wins the back lat spread. Now moving on to the most muscular, this is an interesting one. Paul is in theory good at this pose. On paper he should be winning this pose because once again he's just bigger, but he looks really imbalanced and not very symmetrical in this pose. His upper chest especially looks quite concave. His delts look completely imbalanced. His traps are they're a pretty odd shape. His midsection is tight, and he's got well-defined abs, and his legs, his quads look quite good. From this angle, you can see he's got some feathering through here, some vascularity, and he's got crazy vascularity through his chest and delts, and through his arms as well. But when you compare it to Bonac, who also does have a bit of vascularity, and is just way more balanced overall, there's zero weak body parts here. His chest looks strong, delts look great, arms are thick, so the forearms, his quads have a greater sweep. Yeah, maybe his arms aren't quite as good as Paul's overall, but the overall balance of the physique, I think, is winning it for him in the hands clasped. Now, Paul does fare a fair bit better in the crab most muscular. You can see he's showing off his broad structure and giant arms a fair bit better. And this pose it's easier to hit than the hands clasp, so he can kind of hide his poor posing. But Bonac is very strong in this pose as well. You can see he seems to have better, more striations perhaps, although he's lacking that grainy vascularity that the 90s bodybuilders tended to show. But he's very balanced in this physique. It certainly wouldn't be a runaway pose for either of them. As in relative to each other, of course. You could make an argument for either of them winning this pose. I personally prefer the look of Bonac's pose, but you could make an argument for either of them winning the crab. However, I think overall, Bonac wins the most muscular because he's just more versatile in it. He has zero weaknesses. He can hit pretty much every variation of it, whereas Paul was really only good at maybe the crab, maybe the hands on hips. I haven't really seen him hit it. But Bonac, he was just strong in all of them. So that concludes the first round of the 90s and now, and the results stand at 5-4 in favour of Paul Dillet. This was a surprisingly close contest, and really, you can make a case for either of these guys winning. Paul Dillet is giant and freaky, but William Bonac is fully complete, and definitely a much stronger poser. Personally, I would go with Bonac over Dillet. I just prefer his physique more overall, but I'll let you guys decide who you think the winner is. Anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Farewell.